The planet looks soft from up here. That was the first thing Fleet Speaker Vossarine of the Kelnara Dominion always noticed when he looked down at it through the observation glass. Blue and gray and white, wrapped in cloud, turning slowly the way all conquered things eventually turned. Quiet, unhurried, like it had accepted the weight of what sat above it. 3 years of occupation, and the planet still looked the same as the day they had arrived. Same colors, same slow spin. He found that reassuring. He was wrong to find it reassuring. The Kelnara had taken 14 worlds before Earth, 14 species cataloged, assessed, subdued, and folded into the Dominion's expanding body like ingredients into a dish that had been cooking for 4 centuries. The process was known. The pattern was reliable. First came the initial military phase. Fast, overwhelming, designed not to destroy but to demonstrate. Then came the resistance phase, which varied in intensity but never in outcome. Then the long attrition, 30, 40 years of slow grinding. And finally the assimilation phase, where the conquered species stopped fighting the new shape of their world and simply became part of it. 11 days. That was how long the initial military phase had taken on Earth. 11 days from first orbital contact to full ground control. The Kelnara had sent the number to the galactic consensus like a trophy, like a carved stone set on a shelf. The consensus had acknowledged it with the diplomatic equivalent of polite applause. Other member species had noted the figure in their intelligence files under the heading, Kelnara Operational Efficiency, updated. Vossarine had been proud of 11 days. He still was, technically. The pride sat in him like furniture. Always there, not often noticed. He turned from the observation glass and walked back to his desk. The morning reports were stacked in the order his assistant had arranged them. He read them the way he read all reports. Thoroughly, efficiently, with the particular kind of attention that had made him Fleet Speaker at 240 years old and kept him there for 60 more. He read the labor output figures first because they were the most useful indicator of occupation health. He read them twice. Then he set them down and looked at the wall for a moment. The labor outputs from Earth's occupied territories were not following the expected curve. In every previous occupation, productivity dropped after the initial military phase. It always dropped. The species was in shock. Infrastructure was disrupted. Workers were grieving or afraid or simply disoriented by the new chain of command. The drop was built into the projection models. It was expected and accounted for. On Earth, the outputs had gone up. Not slightly, not within the margin of variation the models allowed for. They had gone up by a number that sat outside every bracket the Dominion's analysts had prepared. Manufacturing rates, agricultural yields, construction completion, all of it trending in a direction that, in any other context, would indicate a species preparing for something large. He made a note. He filed it under cultural anomaly, requires monitoring. He moved to the next report. Birth rates also up. In every previous occupation, birth rates collapsed in the first 2 years. This was understood. Conquered species did not, as a biological rule, bring children into a world that had just been taken from them. The instinct was suppressed by grief and uncertainty. The models had a name for it, biological pessimism response. Earth's birth rates had climbed by 11% in year 1, 14% in year 2. The year 3 projections were still being calculated, but the early numbers suggested the trend was holding. Vossarine made another note. He filed it under cultural anomaly, requires monitoring. He moved to the next report. This one was from the Cultural Integration Department. Specifically from the sub-office that tracked human artistic output, their music, their visual art, their written communication. Cultural tracking was a standard part of any occupation. Art told you things that labor reports couldn't. It told you how a species was feeling at its edges in the places where official compliance didn't reach. The report was 3 pages long. A junior analyst had attached a summary note at the top which said that human artistic output in the occupied territories had increased dramatically and that the dominant emotional registers observed were, and the analyst had used a word here that Vossarine paused on, anticipatory. Not sad, not grieving, not the resigned inward quality that characterized the art of a broken people. anticipatory. There was a subnote beneath this, added by a different analyst. None that described the structural patterns of human music as bearing strong resemblance to what Kelnara anthropologists called pre-combat ritual music in the species that practiced it. The note was careful. It used hedging language. It said similar to and bears resemblance and may indicate rather than saying the direct thing. Vossarine read to the bottom of page 1. He filed the report under cultural anomaly, requires monitoring. He did not read pages 2 and 3. The ground inspection had been scheduled for 6 weeks. Vossarine did ground inspections on a quarterly rotation through the major occupied population centers. It was policy. It was also, in his private assessment, largely unnecessary. The garrison commanders submitted detailed reports and the surveillance network was comprehensive. But policy was policy, and he had not survived 300 years of Dominion service by treating policy as optional. São Paulo was the third stop on the rotation. The city had changed since the initial occupation. Most of the changes were infrastructural. Kelnara communication relays on the high buildings, patrol routes marked in the Dominion's color system on the streets, the particular geometry of Kelnara administrative architecture, visible in 3 or 4 places where older human buildings had been cleared to make room. His security escort, 6 soldiers, with standard complement, walked with him through the central market district on a morning when the sky was white and low, and the air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. The market was full. This surprised him slightly, though he did not let it show on his face. He had expected the subdued, hollow quality that marked the markets of occupied Tethran cities, or the careful, performative ordinariness of the Vren people in the early years of their assimilation. What he got instead was noise, real noise, vendors calling out, children running between adult legs, the smell of food cooking on portable units, 2 men arguing about something with the energetic specificity of people who had been arguing about the same thing for years and enjoyed it. He walked through it. His escort kept close. Nobody looked at him with hatred. He noted this. On Tethran, he had been looked at with hatred constantly, a hot and visible thing in every pair of eyes that passed over him. Here, people looked at him the way people looked at weather, briefly without personal feeling, and then moved on. He noted this in his internal assessment as successful early integration indicators. He watched a woman sell bread from a low cart. She had a specific efficiency to her movements, wrap, hand, exchange, turn, and she laughed at something the woman next to her said, a real laugh, not performed, the kind that arrives before the person deciding to allow it. There was a child beside her, a girl, maybe 7 years old, watching the market with the serious attentions children gave to things they were privately cataloging for later. Vossarine's escort shifted formation slightly as they passed close. The girl looked up. She looked directly at the nearest soldier. Not at Vossarine, at the soldier. She looked at the soldier the way the analyst had described human music, with that quality he didn't quite have the right word for. Then she looked back at her mother. The mother didn't look up from the bread. She was still talking to her neighbor, still laughing at something. Her hand came out from her side, found the child's shoulder, moved the child behind her body, still laughing, still selling bread. The hand had been so fast and so automatic that Vossarine nearly missed it. Nearly. He caught it at the edge of his attention, and something in him, some instrument so old it barely registered anymore, went very slightly still. He kept walking. He dictated his inspection notes into the recorder on his uniform. And he said the market district showed strong signs of normalized daily function. He said economic activity was consistent with integration progress models. He said no overt hostility was observed. He said compliance indicators remained high. He said all of this in the precise, measured language of a fleet speaker's field report. He did not dictate anything about the hand. Back on the ship, the junior analyst who had written the 3-page cultural report was at her desk in the intelligence department going over the year 3 projection data when her superior, a senior analyst named Pelsira, stopped at her station and looked at the screen. Pelsira was 300 years old, which in Kelnara terms meant she was in what humans might call middle age. Experienced enough to know what mattered, young enough to still be disturbed when it mattered badly. She had been with the Dominion's intelligence division for 160 years. She had worked 6 occupations before Earth. She had a particular kind of reputation among her colleagues, not for being wrong, but for being right in ways that made people uncomfortable. She looked at the junior analyst's screen. She said, "Did you finish the cultural report?" The junior analyst said she had. She said Vossarine had received it. Pelsira asked which pages he'd read. The junior analyst said she thought probably just the summary. Pelsira stood there for a moment. She looked at the labor output numbers on the adjacent screen. She looked at the birth rate projections. She looked at a seismic monitoring chart that showed low-level vibration patterns across 6 continents that the geology team had marked as consistent with natural tectonic activity, despite the fact that 3 of the 6 locations were not in geologically active zones. She pulled up the junior analyst's full 3-page report on her own screen. She read all of it. Then she pulled the raw data files that the report was based on and read those too. She sat with what she'd read for a while. The report said that human artistic output had increased dramatically. It said the dominant registers were anticipatory. It said the structural patterns resembled pre-combat ritual music. But what the report's data files showed, when you looked at the raw numbers rather than the processed summary, was something the junior analyst had either not noticed or not known how to name. The increase in artistic output was not random. It was not spread evenly across the human population in the ways that genuine cultural expression typically spread. It was concentrated in specific geographic clusters that corresponded. Pelsira checked this 3 times because she needed to be certain. Exactly with the locations of the seismic anomalies. The music was coming from underground. She opened a new report file. She began typing. She wrote carefully because she had learned in 160 years that carefully written reports got taken seriously in ways that excited ones did not. She laid out the labor output anomaly, the birth rate anomaly, the artistic output patterns, the seismic data, the geographic correlation. She wrote it in plain, unhedged language. She did not use similar to or may indicate. She wrote what the data showed. At the bottom she wrote, "These patterns taken together suggest that the human population is not in the resistance phase of occupation. They appear to have bypassed this phase entirely. What they are currently engaged in is not yet clear. Immediate expanded surveillance of underground geographic zones is recommended." She filed the report to Vossarine. She marked it as high priority. She went to the commissary and got something to drink and sat there thinking about the woman in the market. She hadn't been at the inspection. She was reading about it in the fleet commander's filed notes, which she had access to because it was her job to have access to everything. The notes were thorough and precise, and they said all the right things. They didn't mention the hand. She'd watched the surveillance footage. She'd seen the hand. She'd sat there watching it on a small screen in her small office and felt something land in her chest that she didn't have a Kelnara word for. The child had not been scared. That was the thing. Every occupied species, every single one in Kelnara history, when their children saw the soldiers, the children showed fear. Children always showed fear. It was biological. It was reliable. Pelsira had watched footage from 6 occupations, and the children always showed fear. This child had not been scared. She had looked at the soldier the way you looked at something you were measuring. And the mother had moved her out of the way not to protect her from something frightening. She had moved her out of the way so the child's face wouldn't be seen. Pelsira sat with her drink and looked at the table and thought about 11 days. She thought about the pride in those 11 days, the number that had gone out to the galactic consensus like a trophy. She thought about what it meant to take a world in 11 days and then spend 3 years calling the aftermath normal. She thought about how long it took to build something you needed to hide. She went back to her desk. She started a second report. Vossarine received the report the next morning. He read the summary. The summary was 1 paragraph, and it was written in the direct, plain language of someone who wanted to be clearly understood. He read it. When he considered it, he filed it under cultural anomaly. Requires monitoring. Then he looked out the observation glass at the soft blue planet turning slowly below him. The Kelnara had studied human history for 3 years. They had read everything. The wars, the famines, the collapses, and the slow rebuildings. The centuries of one group taking from another and the centuries of taking it back. They had read all of it, and they had written their assessment in the Dominion's official files, and the assessment said that humanity was a species defined by its capacity for suffering. The assessment was correct. Every word of it was correct. They had read the evidence with precision and care and come to a conclusion that was perfectly, catastrophically wrong. They had seen what humanity endured. They had not asked what humanity did with it. Pelsira had a system for the reports she filed to Vossarine. She kept a private log, just dates and subject lines, nothing classified, so she could track the pattern of what she sent and what came back. It was a habit she developed 40 years into her career after a commanding officer on a different ship in a different occupation had looked her in the eye and said she had never raised a particular concern, when she had in fact raised it 9 times. The log was proof. She had shown him the log. He had not appreciated it. She had kept the log anyway. It was now in the 3rd year of the Earth occupation, 11 entries long. Reports 1 through 3. Labor output anomalies. Flagged as high priority. Response received, noted, it monitoring ongoing. Reports 4 and 5. Birth rate projections. Flagged as high priority. Response received, consistent with post-trauma recovery patterns in comparable species. No action required. Report 6, the seismic data, the one with the geographic correlation to the artistic output clusters. Flagged as urgent. Response received, geology team has reviewed. Natural tectonic activity confirmed. She had then requested the geology team's actual review documents and read them herself. The team had reviewed 3 of the 6 locations. The other 3 they had marked as pending review 9 months ago. She filed report 7 pointing this out. Response received. Pending review locations added to next quarterly assessment schedule. Report 8 was the one she had written after spending 6 hours cross-referencing human communication intercepts with the seismic location data. Communication intercepts were not her department. She had requested access from the Signals Intelligence Office, been told it required a commander-level authorization, filed the authorization request, waited 3 weeks, received partial access, and worked with what she had. What she had was enough to see that something was moving through human communication channels that the Kelnar encryption analysis software was not catching. Not because it was unencrypted, it was encrypted. It was encrypted in a way that the software kept categorizing as standard civilian commercial traffic because the encryption was built to look like standard civilian commercial traffic from the outside. She had only spotted it because she was looking at the metadata rather than the content, and the metadata had a particular rhythm to it that didn't match anything in the civilian commercial traffic baseline. She flagged report 8 as critical. She had never used that flag before in her career. Response received. Signals Intelligence has reviewed the flagged intercepts. Civilian commercial traffic confirmed. Encryption analysis software updated to account for post-occupation format variations. She sat with that response for a long time. Then she filed Report 9. Report 9 was the longest one. It was 14 pages. Once she had gone back to the beginning, all the way back to the initial invasion assessment, and pulled every data point that the standard models had categorized as expected, normal, or within variation range, and she had put them all on the same page and drawn a single line through them. The line was not a metaphor. She had literally drawn a line through the data points on a visual chart, the way the most junior analysts learn to look for patterns in their first year of training, the most basic method in the field. The line went in one direction. Everything was trending the same way. Labor, births, art, seismic activity, communication patterns, the encrypted traffic. Wouldn't the fact that 17 Kelnera garrison commanders across 4 continents had filed reports in the last 6 months, noting that certain human civilian population movements in their sectors were difficult to predict using standard models? One garrison commander had written in the plain soldier's language that officers sometimes use when they thought nobody important was reading, "These people go where we don't expect them to go. They know our patrol schedules better than my own deputies." Pelsira had included that quote in Report 9, verbatim. She had flagged Report 9 as critical. She had also, for the first time, he sent a copy of it to the Galactic Consensus Intelligence Liaison attached to the fleet, a courtesy protocol that technically required Vossarine's authorization, but that she had sent anyway and was prepared to defend if asked about it. She was not asked about it. Vossarine's response to Report 9: the concerns raised in this report have been reviewed. The data points cited represent a collection of unconnected anomalies. Pattern-seeking analysis of this kind, while showing initiative, can generate false correlations when individual data points are treated as a unified signal. Analyst Pel Sira is reminded that Earth is currently in year 3 of a projected 40-year assimilation timeline. Variance from projected models at this stage is expected. No escalation warranted. She read that response 4 times. And then she opened a new file. She started Report 10. 412 meters below the surface of what had once been a functioning copper mine in Zambia, there was no natural light. There had not been natural light at this depth since the mine was operational, and before that there had been darkness here since the beginning of everything. The dark was old and total, and the humans working in it had been down here long enough that the temporary lighting rigs had started to feel like sunlight, which was either a sign of adaptation or a sign of how long they had been underground. And the difference between those two things was one Yara Solis did not spend time on. She had been underground for 9 months, not continuously. She came up. She had a rotation schedule. Shema, the same schedule she enforced for everyone else. 2 weeks down, 4 days up, because the psychological research on extended underground operations was clear about the minimum surface time a person needed to stay functional, and she needed functional people more than she needed dedicated ones. Dedication without function was just a feeling. She did not have time for feelings. She was standing at the edge of a platform looking down. Private Danilo Reyes was standing next to her. It was his first time at this level. He had come up through the Eastern Tunnel network from the Manila hub, which had only connected to the central structure 3 weeks ago, and this was his first briefing at the main site. He had been told to report to Admiral Solis at the main platform, and he had done that, and now he was standing at the edge of the platform looking down at the same thing she was looking at. He hadn't said anything for 40 seconds. That was unusual for Reyes. Solis had read his file before this briefing. His commanding officer's notes said, in the careful professional language officers used when they liked someone but weren't supposed to say so directly, that Reyes was effective, committed, and, this was the word the officer had used, incapable of silence for more than 30 consecutive seconds. He had now been quiet for 42. Pare, he finally said. He was not talking to her. He was talking to the air. That's unhinged, he was grinning. The grin was wide enough that it was doing things to the geometry of his face. Solis did not look down. She had been looking at it for 9 months in various stages of completion, and she knew what was there. She was looking at the assembly crew instead. The 230 people currently on the floor below, visible from up here as small moving figures under the rig lights, each of them doing a specific practice thing as part of a sequence that had been designed and redesigned over 3 years in rooms like this one across 6 continents. They had hands covered in grease and eyes that had the particular hollowness of people who had stopped tracking day and night because it stopped mattering. They were still working. They had been working for 9 months, and before that, they had been somewhere else working on the parts that were now assembled here. 2 weeks, she said. Reyes looked at her. From when? He said. From now. He looked back down. His grin changed. It didn't get smaller. It got a different quality. Less surprised, more settled, like something had clicked into place behind it. 2 weeks, he said. Yes. A woman from the crew appeared at the platform edge with 2 cups of coffee. She held them out. Solis took one. Reyes took the other. The woman went back down without a word. Solis drank the coffee. It was bad coffee. The supply lines underground made good coffee a logistical problem nobody had prioritized, which was the correct decision. And she drank it anyway because it was hot, and she had been awake since the previous day's 0400 briefing, and the body needed what it needed. Reyes drank his and looked down at the crew. He said, "How many places like this?" 11 main sites, she said. 43 secondary. He was quiet for a moment. All connected? The tunnel networks finished primary connection 8 weeks ago. Secondary connections are at 86%. Another pause. He was doing math, she could tell. Not the strategic kind, the human kind. The kind where you tried to understand the size of something by multiplying what you could see by what you'd been told existed elsewhere. That's, he said, and stopped. That's a lot of people. Yes. Who have been doing this for 3 years and not... Yes. He nodded slowly. He understood what the yes meant. 3 years and not a single leak that the Kelnara intelligence network had caught. 3 years of people going underground and coming up and going back to their surface lives and doing their surface compliance and feeding their children and selling their bread in their markets, and not one of them had broken in a way that mattered. He thought about that. He looked at his coffee cup. Lodi, he said quietly, not to her, to nobody. She finished her coffee. She set down the cup. She looked at him and said, "There is a briefing at 1400 for your unit. Everything you need to know about your specific operational role will be in that briefing. Questions before then, bring them to Lieutenant Aguilar." "Yes, Admiral." She started to walk back along the platform toward the operations center. "Admiral," she stopped. "Was it always going to be this?" he said. "From the beginning? Was this always the plan?" She considered the question. She considered briefly whether it was the kind of question that needed an answer, or the kind that was really just a person adjusting to something large. "From the second week," she said. "The first week we survived. The second week we started planning." She walked back to the operations center. Reyes stood at the edge of the platform for another minute. He looked down at the crew. He looked at the thing they had built in the dark over 3 years and 9 months with nothing but time and need and the specific, patient, grinding human ability to do an enormous amount of work quietly. He had a word for it. He'd had the word for a long time, actually, since he was a kid in Manila watching his grandfather build things in the small workshop at the back of their house. Slow and careful, piece by piece, not stopping when the piece didn't fit, but figuring out why it didn't fit and fixing the reason. The word was home. He finished his coffee. He went to find Lieutenant Aguilar. On the ship above, Pelsira was finishing Report 10 when the signal's intelligence overnight data came through her queue. It came through every morning. She had been reading it every morning for 6 months, looking for the pattern in the encrypted traffic, the rhythm in the metadata that the software kept miscategorizing as civilian commercial. She almost missed it. She almost missed it because she was tired and because she had been looking for the pattern for 6 months, and the mind after that long started to blur what it was looking for. She had to stop, back up, look again. She looked again. The pattern had changed, not disappeared, changed. The rhythm had shifted. The intervals between transmission clusters were shorter, more frequent, and the geographic distribution had expanded. 3 months ago, she had identified 19 origin points. This morning's data showed 31. She pulled up her map. She plotted the new points. She sat very still. All 31 origin points were underground, not near underground structures, not in buildings with deep foundations or basement levels. Underground in the way that required you to go down deliberately, significantly, further than any civilian purpose required. She ran the encryption analysis herself, manually, bypassing the software she no longer trusted, using the long methods she had learned in her first decade of fieldwork before the automated systems existed. Once it took 4 hours. It was the right call. The encryption was not civilian commercial, it was military grade. Kelnara military grade, or built to a standard that matched Kelnara military encryption so precisely that the difference, if there was a difference, was below what she could measure with available tools. She read that result again. Human-generated signals from underground origin points across 6 continents, encrypted to Kelnara military standard. She looked at the result for a long time. Then she opened Report 10, which she had been in the middle of writing, and she deleted what she had written and started again. She wrote it in the shortest, plainest language she could manage. She removed every hedge, and she removed every may indicate and every bears resemblance. She wrote what the data showed directly and without decoration. She wrote at the end, "We have made an error. I do not yet know the size of it. Immediate escalation to full intelligence review is required." She flagged it critical. She sent it to Vossarine. She sent copies to the Galactic Consensus Intelligence Liaison, the fleet's senior tactical officer, and the Dominion's Intelligence Oversight Board on the homeworld, all of which technically required authorizations she did not have. She sent them anyway. Then she sat at her desk and looked at her private log. 11 entries. She added the 10th entry with the date and the subject line, and then she sat there looking at the list of them, all the way back to the first report 3 years ago. The one about the labor outputs that had gone up instead of down. She had known then, not with data, with something older than data, the thing that lived underneath analysis and sometimes moved faster. She had known then that something was wrong with the shape of what they were looking at. She had filed her reports. She had been told she was pattern seeking. She had kept filing. One floor above her, Voss Arene received report 10. He read it. He read it carefully this time. All of it, including the encryption analysis data and the mapped origin points. He sat with it for a long time. Then he sent Pelsira a response. It said, "Noted." He looked out the observation glass. The planet still looked soft, still blue and gray and white, turning the slow, quiet turn of things that had accepted what sat above them. He told himself this. Below in the dark that was 400 meters deep and 11 main sites wide and 43 secondary sites wide and tunnel networked across 6 continents, 230 people kept working. The coffee was still bad. Nobody complained about it. The decision that ended the Kelnara occupation of Earth was made by a minor functionary who was bored. His name was Doric. He had been posted to the garrison at what the Kelnara administrative system called Northern Sector 7. The humans who lived there still called it Manitoba, but the Kelnara files did not use human place names because the Kelnara files had been built by people who considered human place names a detail not worth storing. Doric had been in Northern Sector 7 for 14 months. When he had arrived expecting something and found nothing, a flat, cold territory, partially agricultural, with a human population that was compliant in the exhausting, frictionless way that gave a garrison commander nothing to do. No resistance cells to track, no incidents to report, no sense that anything he did on any given day mattered to the functioning of the occupation in any measurable way. He had filed the boredom, in the professional sense, by writing increasingly detailed garrison reports that nobody read in any detail. He had filed it, in the personal sense, less constructively. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd year of the occupation, Doric reviewed his sector's labor quota reports and found that 2 of the agricultural collectives under his command were behind on their monthly output targets. Behind by 8% in one case and 11% in the other. The shortfalls had explanations. One was weather-related, one was a mechanical failure in processing equipment that the human maintenance crew was already fixing. And both collectives had submitted formal variance requests through the correct administrative channels, which meant the shortfall was documented, explained, and in the process of being resolved. Doric did not feel like waiting for it to be resolved. He was bored and he had authority, and in 14 months of occupation, he had never actually used his authority for anything that felt like authority. And there was a particular kind of person, the Kelnara had a word for it that translated roughly to a man made small by peace, for whom that absence became its own unbearable pressure. He announced a ration reduction, 20% across both collectives, effective immediately, to be lifted when the quota shortfall was recovered. He announced it without consulting the regional command structure, without filing a review request, without checking the occupation health protocols that specified, in clear language, the conditions under which ration alterations were permitted and the approval levels required. He announced it on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday noon, 3,000 people in Northern Sector 7 knew about it. By Tuesday afternoon, a woman in one of the agricultural collectives, a logistics coordinator named Fatima, who had a second job that Doric's surveillance network had never detected, had encoded the information and sent it through a channel that Pelsira was still in the process of trying to convince Vossarine to look at. By Tuesday evening, Yara Solis had received the message. She read it once. She set down her tablet. She looked at the wall of the operations center for a moment, not at anything on it, just at the wall. And something in her face did a thing that the one person in the room with her, a signals officer named Ravi, noticed and then looked away from, because it was not the kind of thing you looked at directly. She said, "Get me the line." Ravi got her the line. The call connected 12 locations across 6 continents. The delay from the network's routing was just under 2 seconds, which meant that when anyone spoke, there was a small lag before the confirmation came back. And on a call like this, with people who had spent 3 years learning to be precise, that 2-second gap was respected. Nobody talked over it. Nobody rushed. Solis had called this group 4 times before, twice for operational updates, once to push back a timeline, once to address a security concern in the European hub that had turned out to be manageable but needed everyone to know. She had not called this number to start anything. They all knew that. They had known for 3 years what it would mean when this call came through. They had planned around it, worked toward it, calibrated every decision in every underground facility on every continent against the question of when it would come. And they had also, in the quiet way of people who had learned not to need things, prepared themselves for the possibility that they would spend the rest of their lives waiting for a call that never came. The call came. Solis laid out the ration reduction, its scope, its authorization level, its timeline. She stated it without editorializing. The facts were enough. There was a silence on the line. Not a confused silence. The understanding kind, where everyone is arriving at the same place and giving each other time to finish arriving. A man in Johannesburg spoke first. He said, "The network is at 86% tunnel connectivity." A woman in Jakarta said, "Primary systems are at full readiness. Its secondary systems are at 92. Someone in Hamburg said the Northern European Assembly was complete and had been at standby for 6 weeks. One by one, around the 12 locations, people reported their numbers. Solis listened. She did not write anything down. She had been holding these numbers in her head for months, and she knew what each update meant. When the last report was in, there was another silence. A man in Nairobi said, "Is it time?" Solis said nothing for 4 seconds. She was not deciding. She had decided a long time ago. She was just giving the 4 seconds to what they were worth. "It's time," she said. The first thing that happened was nothing visible. That was intentional. The first wave was not designed to be seen. It was designed to be felt, in the way a room feels different when someone has moved through it, not moving anything, just displacing air. 17 Kelnara communication relays across 4 continents went dark. Not damaged, not destroyed. They were simply no longer transmitting. From the ground, a person standing under one of the relay towers would not have noticed anything different. The towers still stood. The lights on them still blinked their regular patterns. The relay's outward appearance was unchanged. Inside, the signal had been redirected. The humans had spent 14 months learning the relay architecture, patiently, piece by piece, through the garrison access logs that human maintenance crews kept on file for every repair job. Unearthed through the specs that a Kelnara technical officer had once left loaded on a device that a human interpreter had been allowed to handle for 11 minutes, through the careful, incremental process of understanding a system well enough to reroute it without breaking it. They had not broken anything. They had simply changed where the signal went. The relay network now ran on the same towers, the same physical infrastructure. But the signal moved through human-controlled routing nodes that had been installed alongside the original Kelnara components over 18 months, disguised in the maintenance logs as standard vibration-dampening equipment. The Kelnara garrison commanders in the affected areas noticed the communication disruption at different times, depending on how often they used the relays for routine traffic. The first notice came from a commander in Eastern Europe who tried to file a standard afternoon report and got no response from the regional hub. She tried the backup channel. Also no response. She tried the emergency frequency. She got a response on the emergency frequency. It was a human voice. It identified itself in fluent Kelnara as the new routing authority for the regional communications network. It said politely that emergency communications were still available and would be managed through the new routing system. It said that all non-emergency traffic would resume within 72 hours pending a transition period. It said to have a good afternoon. The garrison commander sat at her desk and looked at her communication unit for a long time. She filed an emergency report to Fleet Command, and the report went through the new routing system. Pelsira was in the middle of writing a follow-up to Report 10, an addendum with new data she had pulled overnight, which she was going to send to Vossarine, along with a second copy directly to the Consensus Oversight Board whether or not she had authorization. When her own communication unit made a sound it had never made before. It was a soft sound, almost polite. The Kelnara alert system was built to be loud. Alerts were supposed to command attention, to cut through whatever you were doing and demand that you stop and look. This sound was not that. This sound was the kind of sound a person made when they stepped into a room and were not sure if they were interrupting. She looked at the screen. 14 simultaneous incident reports, all communication related, all filed in the last 9 minutes. She pulled the first one, read it, pulled the second, read it. She stopped reading individual reports and started looking at the map. The incident locations were appearing on the map as she watched, each one a small marker in the regional communication grid. 14, then 16, then 20. She knew these locations. She had plotted them. In Report 6, in Report 8, in Report 10. The seismic anomaly sites, the encrypted traffic origin points, the places she had been marking for a year and a half while filing reports that came back with noted written on them. The locations were not anomalies anymore. They were operational. She stood up from her desk. She walked directly to Vossarine's command chamber. She did not wait for the attendant to announce her. She walked past the attendant and into the room. Vossarine looked up. She put her tablet on his desk. She had the map on the screen. The markers were still appearing. 23 now, spreading as more garrison commanders filed their reports. She did not speak. The map said it. He looked at it for a long time. When did this begin? He said. The first incident was logged 41 minutes ago. She paused. I believe it began before that. He looked at the markers. He looked at the patterns they made across the continental map. What do they want? He said. It was the question of someone who had spent 300 years in a world where the answer to what do they want was always something you could negotiate. Resources, autonomy, trade terms, a better seat in the administrative structure, something with a shape, something that fit inside a framework he knew. Pelsira looked at the map. She said, I don't think it's that kind of situation. Reyes got the signal at 0340 in a staging area 200 meters below a street in São Paulo that he had walked every day as a kid. The signal was a single tone through the earpiece. Clean, short, the tone they had all been trained on for 6 months. When you heard it, you moved. He moved. Around him, 48 other people moved. Nobody said anything. They had gone over this enough times that words were extra weight. Everybody knew their position, their route, their first and second objectives. The briefings had been thorough to the point where Reyes, in a quiet moment 2 weeks ago, had told Lieutenant Aguilar that he felt like he'd already done this. Ain't like his body had already done it while his brain was somewhere else. Aguilar had said that was the point. The tunnel had been built with a specific exit point, a maintenance access shaft that emerged in the loading bay of a building that had been, before the occupation, a logistics warehouse, and was now a Kelnara supply depot. The timing of the exit had been coordinated with the communication relay disruption upstairs. The garrison commander responsible for this district would be dealing with a communication failure right now. Her ability to coordinate with adjacent sectors was gone. Her ability to call up to the fleet for support was going through a routing system she didn't control. Reyes came up through the shaft last, because his job in the initial phase was rear security. And when he came up into the loading bay and stood in it for the first time in 3 years of darkness, he did something he hadn't planned to do. He looked at the ceiling. The ceiling of the loading bay had a series of high windows that let in the pre-dawn dark and through the dark. At the angle he was standing, he could see a strip of sky. Not much. Just a strip. Gray-black, the color the sky went in the hour before anything changed. He looked at it for 2 seconds. Then the lieutenant's voice came through the earpiece. Reyes, you're on. He moved. The underground was opening, not in one place, not in the way a wound opens. Sudden, specific, localized. It opened the way water moves under a frozen lake, everywhere beneath the surface at once, pressing against the ice from below, finding the thin places, coming through. On 11 main sites, 43 secondary, the tunnel network that had been built over 3 years, connected over months, brought to standby 6 weeks ago. All of it was moving now. All of it was coming up. And from above, if you had been watching from the right altitude, if you had been watching with instruments calibrated to see the patterns of heat and motion rather than the visual surface, you would have seen the planet exhale, 3 years of held breath, coming out all at once. Vossarine stood at the observation glass and looked at the planet. He had looked at it every day for 3 years, soft and blue and turning, always the same. He looked at it now and the surface looked the same. It looked exactly the same. And somewhere underneath it, in the dark that had been building since before anyone thought to look, something had finally come up into the air. He thought about the woman in the market, the bread, the laugh, the hand that had moved the child aside, not out of fear, but out of something else, something that had no word in the 300 years of his experience, something that was, he understood now, standing at the glass with the incident reports multiplying behind him on the screens. The specific and practiced movement of a person who had been ready for a long time and had simply been waiting for the right moment to stop pretending otherwise. He looked at the planet. It looked back. The feeds were coming in faster than Vossarine could process them. That had never happened before. In 300 years of service, when in 6 occupations and 11 major operational deployments and more administrative crises than he could count from memory, the feeds had always moved at a pace he could follow. He was fast. He had always been fast. Faster than his deputies, faster than the analysts, faster than the situation in almost every case he had encountered. It was the quality he had relied on most over 3 centuries of command. The feeds moved faster. 23 incidents in the first hour, 40 by the second. He had his deputies sorting them by type, by region, by severity, by the categorization system the Dominion's incident response protocols had established over 400 years of occupation management. The categorization system was comprehensive. It had categories for every type of resistance event a conquered species had ever generated. Sabotage, armed uprising, civilian noncompliance, infrastructure disruption, communication interference, coordinated attacks on garrison personnel. The events coming in did not sort cleanly. They sorted in all the categories at once. He kept coming back to the communication relay reports because communication was the thing that mattered most when everything else was happening simultaneously. You could manage almost anything if you could talk to your people. The relay reports were telling him that his ability to talk to his people was, in the precise language of the incident logs, degraded and continuing to degrade. The relays weren't down. That was the part his deputies kept tripping over when they tried to explain it to each other. And the relays were still standing, still running, still blinking their lights and processing signal. They just weren't processing Kelnara signal anymore. The infrastructure existed. The humans had simply changed what it was for. He received a ground report from Sector 12, Southern Africa, that said the garrison's communication unit was functional, but all outgoing traffic was being acknowledged and responded to by an unfamiliar routing authority that identified itself in perfect Kelnara and then redirected the message. The garrison commander had tested it by sending a standard supply request to the regional hub. The routing authority had confirmed receipt of the request and said it would be forwarded. The regional hub had, 40 minutes later, confirmed receipt of the supply request. The supply request had gone through. The garrison commander had sent a second message, emergency priority, marked for fleet command, asking for instructions on how to handle the routing anomaly. That one had gone through too. Vossarine received it. He sat with it for a moment. The humans had rerouted the Kelnara communication network and then kept it functional. They hadn't broken anything. They hadn't cut anyone off. They had just inserted themselves into the middle of the system and made themselves the necessary step between every message and its destination. He tried to calculate how long it had taken to build that capability. He stopped calculating when the next report came in. The first ship cleared atmosphere at 0614, local time above the southern Pacific Ocean. A Kelnara orbital monitoring station flagged it 3 seconds after it broke cloud cover. The station's automated system ran its identification protocol, hull geometry, propulsion signature, energy profile, and returned a result that had never appeared in the system's database before. Classification, unknown. Origin, unknown. Recommend manual review. The station operator triggered manual review. The manual review process required the operator to compare the visual feed against the Dominion's vessel registry, which contained every known spacecraft configuration in the galactic consensus's recorded history. The operator did this. The operator was thorough. The operator checked the registry twice. The vessel wasn't in it. It was large. That was the first coherent thing the station's report managed to convey. Large and getting larger on the visual feed as it gained altitude and cleared the upper atmosphere. The hull was wrong in the way that something handmade is wrong. Not the precise wrongness of error, but the particular wrongness of something built by people who understood what they were building, but didn't start from the same assumptions. The geometry went in directions that Kelnara shipbuilding didn't go. Not because the Kelnara couldn't have built it that way, because 4 centuries of Kelnara engineering tradition had developed certain answers to certain problems, and those answers had become the only answers anyone thought to try. The humans had tried different answers. The propulsion signature was the part that Pel Sira, watching the monitoring feeds from her station, stared at longest. She ran the analysis 3 times. The 3rd time she ran it, she leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Not because anything was on the ceiling, but because she needed a moment that was not the screen. The propulsion signature was partly Kelnara. She could see the component, the drive system they'd stripped from somewhere, from 17 garrison commanders missing equipment. She understood now, from supply shipments that had arrived short over the past 18 months in ways that the logistics reports had attributed to transit loss. But the rest of the signature was not Kelnara. The rest of it was something else that worked in conjunction with the Kelnara component in a way that should not have improved the output. It improved the output. By the time she finished her 3rd analysis, there were 11 ships on the monitoring feeds. By the time she walked back to Vossarine's command chamber to tell him what she'd found, there were 24. Vossarine looked at the fleet feeds. He had a fleet. He had come to Earth with a fleet that had taken this planet in 11 days and had sat in orbit for 3 years, maintaining the kind of presence that made certain things unnecessary to say. The fleet was the argument. The fleet had always been the argument. A species looked at that many ships and understood, without being told, that resistance was a mathematical problem with only one solution. His fleet was having navigation problems. Not all of it. Not simultaneously. It was coming in cascade. 1 vessel, then 2 hours later another, then 3 at once, then a quiet period, then 4 more. Each vessel reported the same general category of failure. Navigation systems producing coordinates that did not agree with each other. The vessels could still move. They could not agree on where they were or where anything else was. The onboard systems were running self-diagnostics that returned normal results, which meant the problem was not in the hardware. The problem was in the data the hardware was using. The navigation data came from the relay network that now ran through human routing nodes. He stood at the observation glass and looked at the 24 ships that had come up from the surface of a planet that had been, according to every intelligence assessment in the Dominion's files, home to a pre-spaceflight species of moderate technological capability and low strategic threat. He thought about the labor outputs that had gone up, the births, the music his analysts had described as anticipatory, when the 17 garrison commanders who had gone missing without bodies or blood or demands, the seismic data across 6 continents that the geology team had called natural tectonic activity, the encrypted signals from underground sites that the software had categorized as civilian commercial traffic. He thought about Pel Sira's reports, all 10 of them, the dates on them, the priority flags, the one word he had sent back 10 times, and the log she had kept that she had never shown him, but that he was certain existed, because she was the kind of person who kept logs, and he was the kind of commander who had spent 300 years not being the kind of person who needed to be handed one. He could feel the shape of what he had done. It had a very specific shape. It was the shape of a man who had been given the answer repeatedly and had chosen, each time, to file it under things that did not require him to change what he already believed. He watched the ships rise. The fight for Northern Sector 7 lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Reyes was not in Northern Sector 7, he was in Sao Paulo. But the structure of what happened in Northern Sector 7 was the same structure as what happened in Sao Paulo, and in Johannesburg, and in Jakarta, and in Hamburg, and in all the other places where the ground opened on that morning, because they had all been planned by the same people working from the same principles. And the principles were these: take the structure intact, minimize destruction, offer the exit. Every garrison in every location received the same message at the same time, so delivered through the new routing system in formal Kelnara. Evacuation corridors were open at specified coordinates. They had 6 hours. The message identified itself as coming from Admiral Yara Solis of the Earth Defense Command, a title and an organization that had not, as far as the Kelnara knew, existed 24 hours ago. The message said this was a courtesy. Some of the garrison commanders took the corridors immediately. Some waited and assessed. Some tried to fight. The ones who tried to fight discovered that the humans who had come up from the underground had spent 3 years learning to do this very specifically. Not generically, not with the improvised tactics of desperate people, but with the specific, practiced, a repetitive competence of people who had trained for a single set of objectives and had been training for a very long time. Reyes's unit took their objective in 2 hours and 6 minutes. He did not remember most of those 2 hours and 6 minutes the way he remembered other things. He remembered them the way you remembered a bad fever, in pieces, in temperature and sound, in the specific smell of certain moments rather than the sequence. He remembered the weight of his own breathing. He remembered a door that opened wrong and the half-second of adjusting. He remembered a voice from his earpiece, calm, specific, and his body responding before his mind had finished listening. He came back to himself sitting against a wall in the corridor of what had been, until this morning, a Kelnara administrative building. His hands were in his lap. He looked at them. There was something on his sleeve that had been there since the first 10 minutes. He looked at the sleeve. He did not look at it for long. He put it somewhere. Aguilar came around the corner and said they had the building and needed to move to the secondary objective. Reyes said yes. He stood. The wall behind him was a human wall. This building had been human before the occupation, had been repurposed, and beneath the Kelnara modifications there were still the original fixtures, the original paint in one corner where a panel had been removed. He noticed this as he stood. He noticed it and moved on. He moved through the rest of that morning on the outside of himself, in which was not unfamiliar. He had been told in training that some people experience this, and that it was the body's way of managing things it could not carry all at once, and that it would come back later, and you would feel all of it later, and you would need to let yourself feel it later. But right now you moved and you did the job, and you trusted your training. He trusted his training, he moved. The broadcast went out at 1400 fleet time. Pelsira heard it first because she was monitoring all channels, and the broadcast hit all channels simultaneously. Kelnara and Galactic Consensus both. Translated automatically into every registered language of every consensus member species in real time. She heard it come through her equipment, and she recognized the voice because she had read the intelligence file on Admiral Yara Solis of the Earth Defense Command 3 times since that name had appeared in the morning's evacuation corridor message. The voice was not what she expected. She had constructed from the file a mental picture of what a person who had planned this for 3 years and executed it in a single morning would sound like. She expected intensity. She expected the particular quality of someone who had held something tightly for a very long time and was now setting it down with great care. She expected triumph to be sitting somewhere in the voice, even if the words didn't say it. The voice sounded like a woman reading a list. It was a list, a precise, comprehensive, geographical list of every Kelnar installation, facility, garrison point, relay tower, administrative building, supply depot, and strategic asset that was no longer under Kelnara control. The list was long. Solis read it at a measured pace without emphasis, without pause, without any of the rhetorical decoration that the Kelnara deployed in their own formal communications. She was still reading when the Galactic Consensus went quiet. Not all at once. The way a crowd goes quiet when something happens that everyone sees at the same moment, starting from one point and spreading outward until the whole room has caught up. Pelsira could see the consensus communications traffic on one of her side screens. She watched the traffic volume drop, then drop again, then the particular flatness of a channel where people are listening very hard and none of them are speaking. Solis finished the list. She said at the end, Earth is no longer occupied territory. Any vessels wishing to confirm this assessment are welcome to request a viewing corridor through the new routing authority. Thank you. The broadcast ended. The galactic consensus stayed quiet for 43 seconds. Pelsira timed it. The consensus emergency session convened 4 hours after the broadcast. Vossarine was patched in from the fleet because he could not leave the fleet and he was required to attend. He sat in a small communication room and looked at the assembled delegates on the screen, and they looked at him. He had aged in a way that did not show on his face. 300 years of Kelnara physiology meant the face changed slowly. But that was in him somewhere, visible to anyone who knew how to look for it. And the first delegate said that the consensus was observing the situation with great concern. The first delegate said that the consensus would of course be reviewing the circumstances that had led to this outcome. The first delegate said that a full inquiry would be established. Vossarine listened. He said, I require fleet support. There was a pause. The first delegate said, we are observing. The words landed the way they were supposed to land. He heard them correctly the first time, understood them without needing them repeated. The consensus was watching what had happened to the Kelnara fleet by a species that had built its own fleet in secret while being occupied. And the consensus was deciding in real time whether the thing they had all just watched was something they wanted to walk toward. It was not. Aron, he said, I see. He ended the call. He sat in the small communication room for a while. Outside it, his staff were managing the operational situation, the ongoing evacuation from the surface, the fleet's attempts to stabilize its navigation systems, the logistics of a situation that none of their manuals covered because no manual had ever needed to cover it. He thought about Pelsira's 10 reports. He thought about Report 1, the labor outputs, Year 1 of the occupation, the number that had gone up instead of down. He had filed it under cultural anomaly, requires monitoring. He sat with that. He sat with it for a long time. Outside the window of the communication room, in the distance, he could see the human ships moving in the dark. Watch, they moved differently from Kelnara ships. The geometry of them was wrong in that handmade way. The trajectories they chose were not the trajectories his fleet's tactical models would have chosen, and they were moving with a calm, unhurried confidence that he recognized. He recognized it because it was the same confidence he had projected from above for 3 years. He looked at it from below. He looked at it for a long time. 18 days. That was how long it took. 11 days to fall. 18 days to take it back. 7 more days than the fall had taken, which the Kelnara's Tactical Analysis Office would spend considerable time on later. The reports would note the asymmetry, would attempt to identify what accounted for the extra 7 days. Sean would eventually conclude in careful professional language that the additional time was attributable to the human operations' systematic emphasis on structural preservation over speed of resolution. They hadn't been slower because they were weaker. They had been slower because they were being careful not to break what they were taking back. The Kelnara were gone from Earth by the end of day 18. Not all dead, not all gone from the broader system, but gone from the surface, gone from the orbit they had held, gone from the communications infrastructure they had believed they owned. The evacuation corridors that Solis had offered in the first hours of the operation had been used by more garrison personnel than anyone had formerly projected. Reyes, in a conversation with Aguilar 3 days after the main operation, said that surprised him. Aguilar said it shouldn't. He said that soldiers everywhere were essentially the same type of person, people who had accepted a risk for a reason, and that when the reason changed, the calculation changed. He said the garrison commanders had signed on to occupy a defeated planet. When the planet stopped being defeated, their contract with the situation expired. Reyes thought about that. He was sitting on a piece of broken masonry in a street in São Paulo. The street was his street, the one he had grown up on, the one he had watched change under 3 years of occupation, the one that had Kelnara administrative markers on the buildings and Kelnara route colors on the ground that nobody had gotten around to removing yet, because removing them was a low priority compared to every other thing that needed doing. And he was eating something from a paper bag. He didn't know what it was exactly. Someone had handed it to him and he was eating it because he couldn't remember when he'd last eaten something that wasn't an operational meal pack. The sky had ships in it, human ships. He could see 3 from where he was sitting. You had to look at the right angle, past the buildings, into the strip of blue-gray between them. 3 ships that had come up from the dark 11 days ago and were still up there, and would be up there for a long time, because the world had changed, and some of the things that marked the change were things you could see from the street. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from his mother. She had been sending messages every day for 10 days, since the news broke on every channel that the occupation was over, that the Kel Nara were withdrawing, that the ground operations were successful. He had not responded to most of them because he had not had the capacity to respond, and also because he did not know what to say that covered the distance between what she knew and what had actually happened. The message said, "Call me. You said you would call." He had said that. He had said that in a calm 2 weeks before the operation, in the careful, nothing language of a person who couldn't say what they were planning but needed someone to know they were still there. He had said, "Call me after," and she had said, "After what?" And he had said, "Just after." And she had known him long enough to not ask again. He called. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting with the phone near her. She cried. The kind of crying that came from 3 years of deciding not to, all arriving at once. He said he was fine. She did not believe him. He could hear that she didn't believe him, hear the specific shape of a mother's not believing in the silence between her words. He said it again. She asked if he was hurt. He said he was fine. She asked if he ate. He held up the paper bag even though she couldn't see it. He told her he ate. He told her he was sitting on a street in their city. She asked if it was still their city. He looked at the broken masonry. He looked at the Kel Nara markers on the buildings. He looked at the ships in the strip of sky between the buildings. "Yeah, Lodi," he said. "Still ours." She cried again. He let her. He sat on the masonry and ate whatever was in the paper bag and looked at the ships and let her cry for as long as she needed to. When she stopped, she asked when he was coming home. He said soon. She asked what soon meant. He said it meant soon. She knew what that meant too. It meant there were things he couldn't say yet, and she would have to trust him. She had been trusting him for 3 years. She said, "Okay, soon." He said, "Yeah." He said it the way a person said a thing they intended to make true. The Galactic Consensus emergency session took 12 days to formally convene. Not because the consensus moved slowly, in genuine emergencies it could convene within hours, but because this situation had required a different kind of preparation. The delegations needed briefings. The briefings required analysis. The analysis required agreeing on what had actually happened before you could agree on what it meant. And agreeing on what had actually happened meant sitting with a sequence of events that the consensus had watched in real time on live feeds and still did not entirely believe. The chamber where the session was held had been built 300 years ago by the species that first proposed the Galactic Consensus as a formal body. It was designed deliberately and explicitly to make smaller species feel small. The ceiling was extraordinary, high and vaulted and covered in materials that caught light from every angle so that the whole surface seemed to glow. The delegation tables were wide and long and arranged in a careful arc that put the presiding seat at a point where every delegate could see it and feel seen from it. Everything about the architecture was a statement about the size of the thing that happened here. Yara Solis walked into it in her working uniform, not dress blues, not the formal attire that the Consensus Protocol Handbook specified for delegation representatives appearing before the full chamber. Her working uniform, the one she had worn underground, repaired in the places that had needed repair, faded in the places that fabric faded when you wore it for months in artificial light. There was a scar in the left sleeve where something had torn and been stitched closed with a thread that wasn't quite the right color. She had not had it fixed properly because fixing it properly had never been a high enough priority. She sat down alone at the table designated for the Earth delegation. The table had been built for 30. There was one chair placed at it because the Consensus Protocol Office had not known what else to do and had put one chair and hoped that covered it. She sat in the one chair and looked at the 47 delegates across the arc from her. 47 species, Some of them she recognized from Kelnera intelligence files she had spent 3 years studying. Some of them she was seeing for the first time. They were all looking at her. She had spent 3 years underground. She had spent 3 years sleeping in rotation and eating meal packs and holding the frame of an operation across 6 continents together through the specific, exhausting, unglamorous work of managing people and resources and timelines and problems and setbacks and human beings who were sometimes brave and sometimes frightened and always tired. She had not spent 3 years becoming comfortable with being looked at. She looked back. The first delegate opened the session with the formal ceremonial language that opened every consensus session. The language was long and stylized and spoken in a tone that was designed to remind everyone present that what happened in this room mattered to the shape of everything outside it. 3 delegates across the arc were watching her during the ceremonial language. She watched them back. When it was done, the first delegate said, "We welcome the representative of Earth to the Galactic Consensus. We recognize the significant events of the past weeks. We would like to begin by asking what Earth requires from this body going forward." What Earth requires. She noticed the framing. Not what Earth wanted, not what Earth demanded. He requires a word that put the weight on Earth's side, that acknowledged in the diplomatic language of a body that chose its words with great care, that Earth was now in a position to require things. She took a drink of water, set down the cup. She said, "A fair seat at this table. The same rules that apply to every member species apply to us, and someone should update our category number. We're listed as pre-space flight in your registry, which is no longer accurate." The chamber was quiet for a moment. One delegate, she would learn later it was the Vren representative, a species with a particular reputation for saying the true thing in the wrong moment, made a sound. A short, compressed sound, quickly controlled. A laugh stopped before it became one. Solace did not smile. Even the first delegate said that terms would need to be discussed, that the consensus had a formal process for membership review and integration of new full-status members, that there were protocols. She said, "I understand. Take the time you need." She meant it. She had learned in 3 years underground that patience was not the absence of urgency. It was the ability to hold urgency inside stillness. You could need something immediately and still wait, and the waiting didn't make the need smaller. It made you harder to read, which was, in negotiation as an occupation, its own kind of power. The first delegate looked at her for a moment, then the session continued. Pel Sira's final report was 412 pages. She had been writing it for 8 days straight, in the intensive way she worked when she believed the things she was writing mattered. Not all 412 pages were her own writing. A significant portion was compiled data, raw feeds, incident logs, the full record of every communication she had sent and received during the occupation. She included all 10 of her previous reports. She included Vossarine's responses to them. She did not editorialize about the responses. She included them and let them sit. The analysis section was hers entirely. She had written it carefully, as she always wrote carefully, in the plain language that did not hedge. She wrote about the labor outputs. She wrote about the births and the music and the seismic data and the encryption signatures. She wrote about what each of those things meant individually and what they meant together. She wrote, "Murray Yifronatiarnon Sanenaikidium." In the section she titled simply Assessment. The Kelnara's error was not intelligence failure. Our intelligence was largely accurate. Our data collection identified the correct signals in the correct time frame. The error was interpretive. We collected information about a species we believed we understood and filtered that information through the understanding we already had. When the data did not fit the existing model, we adjusted the data. We did not adjust the model. The specific misunderstanding was this. We identified human capacity for suffering correctly and categorized it as a weakness. Across 14 previous occupations, capacity for suffering in a conquered species indicated breakability. We applied this historical pattern to a species for which suffering was not a feature of weakness, but a condition of development. Or humanity did not suffer toward defeat. Humanity suffered toward competence. This distinction was available in the data from the first weeks of occupation. It was not seen because we were not looking for it. They were not hiding. We were not looking. The last two lines she left alone. She did not follow them with additional analysis. She had learned in 160 years of writing reports that some things needed a paragraph after them, and some things needed the space. Those two lines needed the space. She submitted the report to the Dominion's Intelligence Oversight Board, to the Galactic Consensus Intelligence Committee, and to every fleet commander with an active commission. She submitted it under her own name and her own clearance level, and without Vossarine's co-signature, because Vossarine's position was currently under formal review, and she had not asked him. She sent him a copy anyway. Vossarine received it on the transport vessel taking him home. He was no longer fleet speaker. The title was being restructured. His role was being reviewed. None of this surprised him. He had known from the moment the first feed came through, the moment he had looked at 14 incident reports and understood, with the clarity that came too late, what he was looking at, that the accounting would come. 300 years of service gave you a long understanding of how the accounting worked. You earned the title on the way up, and you gave it back on the way down, and the balance sheet was always, in the end, precise. He had been wrong, not carelessly wrong, not lazily wrong. He had been wrong in the specific, in a thorough way of a person who was very good at their job and had built a set of assumptions over 300 years that were, within the frame of everything he had previously encountered, correct. The assumptions had been correct for 14 occupations. The assumptions had been correct for 4 centuries of Dominion expansion. He read the 412 pages. He read all of them. It took most of the transport's journey. He did not rush. He had spent a great deal of his professional life reading quickly, and this was not a document he wanted to read quickly. He wanted to understand it the way it deserved to be understood, which was to say completely, including the parts that were about his own decisions, including the 10 copies of his one-word responses, including the clear and documented picture of a person who had been handed the answer and had filed it under things that did not require him to change what he already believed. He read the last 2 lines. They were not hiding. We were not looking. He sat with those lines for a while. The transport moved through the dark outside the window. He looked at the dark. He had looked at a lot of dark over 300 years, and it had always been the background, the space between things that mattered. He looked at it now and thought about what it contained, the things people build in it, in the patient dark, while others looked at the surfaces above and called the surfaces everything. He opened a communication file. He had not filed a personal report in years. Commanders filed operational reports, intelligence assessments, strategic reviews. A personal report, a single communication from a single person to an oversight board, was something junior officers did when they believed they had observed something that should be on record. He typed 3 words. She was right. He submitted it. Then he put the tablet down and looked out the window at the dark and at the stars beyond it, and thought about a planet turning soft and blue and quiet that had been, the whole time, none of those things. The file update went through 9 days after the consensus session. A technician in the Galactic Consensus Data Management Office, human, one of the first to begin the exchange program that Solus had negotiated as part of the interim terms, was reviewing the species registry for filing errors when she found Earth's entry still showing the old classification. She flagged it. She submitted a revision request through the correct channels with the correct documentation and the correct supporting reference to the events of the past 18 days, which she assumed would make the revision straightforward. It took 6 days to ratify, not because the ratification was disputed. Nobody disputed it. But because the committee responsible for species classifications could not agree on the language. Every category in the registry had been built for species whose position in the galactic order was known and stable. Earth did not fit any existing category. They had tried 5 different framings before settling on the one that fit best, which was to say the one that was most honest about what they were looking at. The new classification read, Category Unassigned. The technician saw it go through and noted it in her daily log. She thought about flagging it again. Unassigned didn't seem like much of an improvement over pre-space flight, but she had 4 other files to process before her shift ended, and she moved on. She did not see the internal note that Pelsira had added to the file. The note was not visible in the standard registry view. It was in the administrative layer. the one that fleet commanders and intelligence officers accessed during operational briefings. It had been added without formal authorization, in the same spirit that Pelsira had always operated in when formal authorization was too slow for what the situation needed. It said, "Do not assume stillness is weakness. Do not assume patience is defeat. Do not make them wait." And beneath that, added as a filed reference tag so that the note would surface in every future operational briefing where Earth appeared as a relevant party. Reference mandatory. No exceptions. The galaxy went on, more carefully than before, with a specific quality of attention it had not previously needed to practice. The kind you had when you understood, for the first time, that the thing you were looking at was not what you thought it was. The kind you had when you understood you were the one who had not been paying attention. The kind you had going forward when you knew better.